Hey guys, Aaron Cybertron Zhang here, and today I'm bringing you another individual Pokemon analysis as part of my VGC 2015 analysis series, where I analyze a single Pokemon in the format and tell you everything you need to know about that Pokemon. If you have not seen the previous ones on Cresselia, Bisharp, Thundurus, and Sylveon, definitely check those out because I think they're pretty helpful. Today we'll be talking about one of the most highly requested ones, Mega Kangaskhan, and this one of course is highly requested because it is the most popular Pokemon currently in VGC 2015. I do have to apologize, this went up a day later than I wanted to, and the upload time was also a bit late, but I hope you guys enjoy. Share it. If you enjoyed the series, as always, please leave a like to show your support, and let's just jump into it. So, as always, we look at its base stats first. Mega Kangaskhan has 105 for HP, 125 for attack, 100 for defense, 100 for special defense, and 100 for speed. So overall, very well rounded. I mean, you look at the defensive stats with 105 HP, 100 defense, and 100 special defense, and that already is pretty impressive. 125 attack is kind of underwhelming, but then you consider that Mega Kangaskhan gets one of the best abilities in the game in Parental Bond, and suddenly, you're not just using that 125 attack for one attack in a turn, or I guess technically it's one attack, but it's really hitting twice, so it's not actually 125 at attack in the sense that you're getting much more damage off than any other Pokemon with base 125 attack would have. And 100 speed's really nice too because, that's faster than the majority of the format. Of course, you're still a bit slower than Pokemon like Gengar and Terrakion, which are actually pretty good counters to Kangaskhan, but for the majority, you can outspeed and even just KO Pokemon immediately, so pretty well-rounded Mega Pokemon. So why you use Mega Kangaskhan? I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory. If you've played any VGC at all, you'll probably know, but Mega Kangaskhan is really one of the best Mega Evolutions in Pokemon in the game. And I don't think it's nearly as centralizing, or I'd say broken, as it was in VGC 2014, because there are a lot more counters out there nowadays, especially like Terrakion or Thundurus paralyzing it, but it's still really good. It definitely has one of the best abilities in the game with Parental Bond. It's got incredibly well-rounded base stats, like I mentioned earlier. 110 speed is a nice benchmark because, like I said, it outspeeds the majority of the Pokemon in the format. It also hits the majority of the metagame for large amounts of damage because it gets access to a strong stab normal type attack, which very few Pokemon in the format can resist. You factor in the move diversity it gets, like low kick, so a fighting type attack and then a dark type attack and then a potential like ice type attack from Ice Punch or a fire type attack from Fire Punch. And suddenly, Mega Kangaskhan just hits your team really hard for at least neutral damage. There are very few Pokemon in the format that can just completely wall it. And so, as a result, Mega Kangaskhan can almost get lots of damage off against basically anything on your team. So, common Kangaskhan builds. Now, according to 3ds.pokemon-gl, which is, the online stats for Battle Spot, 2/3 of Kangaskhan's currently are Jolly, while the other third are Admin. They can really be built for pure offense or with bulk, so I think in the beginning of VGC 2014, history lesson here, most of the people were just using 4-252, 252 spreads. I think Alex Iglozo, who won US Nationals, actually used a very basic spread. When it came to the World Championships, players opted for bulkier spreads. Myself and Marcus Stabter, I think we were the two top Mega Kangaskhan players at Worlds. Both of us opted for much bulkier spreads than your typical 4-252, 252 spread, and that's because we wanted to survive common attacks like Choice Spec, Stroke, Meteor. However, if you look at Winter Regionals, this past set of regionals that just finished up, a lot of the top players actually just used basic 4-252, 252 spreads, which makes sense because Winter Regionals, it's the first regional of the format, you might as well just go in with the most offensive spread. You don't know what attacks you really need to be EVing for, and in the tournament where you have like 9 rounds of Swiss and Top Cut, it makes sense to go for a one that's more consistent. But a couple of examples, like Aaron Trailer, one of my best friends who won St. Louis Regionals, opted for Adamant Nature with 4-252, 252. Michael Fladong, who was also in the top 4 at that same regional championship, used 4-252, 252, but with Jolly. And then a couple of other players, I think Alex Rubin comes to mind. He finished in the top 4 at Virginia, also with Jolly, 4-252, 252. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious that the players who opted for this very basic spread still ended up doing very well at regionals. So, you don't need bulk, and it's interesting because we'll probably see a move towards bulky as the metagame develops, but definitely have no shame in using that kind of spread right now. You should definitely expect Fake Out or Protect when you see a Kangaskhan. Almost all of them carry one, but often not both. It's very rare to see both, actually, but, once you see the Fake Out, you can probably know, okay, this Kangaskhan doesn't have Protect, so you can use that to your advantage. Like I mentioned, expect one normal move, Double Edge, normally for higher damage output. Makes those damage calculations, some Pokemon like to EV to survive returns. Well, if you give it a Double Edge, then it'll actually be picking up knockouts. And then one fighting move, like Pop, Low Kick, Drain Punch, and Hammer Arm. Now, Drain Punch and Hammer Arm aren't as common, but they're definitely tech moves. Hammer Arm, for example, on Trick Room teams can definitely work. Low Kick is really probably the most common one in terms of high damage output without having to reduce your speed, whereas Power Up Punch is an interesting one because while it doesn't pick up knockouts on most Pokemon like Heatran or Hydreigon, where Low Kick would, it still gets a lot of damage off, maybe around 50%, and most importantly, it gives you the +2 attack boost, which is huge because, you know, Kangaskhan is a Pokemon that's already so good, and you give it a free attack boost, and suddenly you can just dish out so much damage. A lot of players still stick with Pup, though Low Kick, you know, being introduced in VGC 2015 is definitely a huge move to consider. So it really depends on the Kangaskhan you're using. So a move pool discussion, I've already mentioned most of these moves. Like, it shouldn't surprise you that the top 4 moves are Fake Out, Sucker Punch, Double Edge, and Low Kick. That's probably the most standard set nowadays, but Return, Power Up, and Protect being the next 3 also make a lot of sense. For the final 3 currently, Ice Punch, Drain Punch, and Facade. Ice Punch makes sense for those 4 times a week Pokemon like Landers or Garchomp, though Intimidate can make it a bit tricky. A Drain Punch there, like I mentioned earlier, a tech move where not used as common, but some Kangaskhan's may be bulkier like the Recovery. I personally don't like it very much because you're not picking up knockouts a lot of the times, and, you know, I don't know. I prefer Low Kick if I were going for damage output, but there's definitely a case for using Drain Punch. The Facade is an interesting move. I honestly do not like it very much because if you consider, let's say you're going to a 9-round tournament, like a regionals, maybe in 3 or 4 of those games your Kangaskhan will be inflicted by a status condition, and that's at most. So maybe in those 3 or 4 games they'll give you an extra boost, but then in the other 5 to 6 games, you're not getting anything out of it, and you're just using a weaker version of Return/Double Edge. Players have made it work in the past. You know, I actually lost one on Road to Ranked a couple of days ago. I think it was a week ago or so, where he had Facade and I burned it. But I don't know. I personally think it's better to go with consistency with Return or Double Edge, but definitely your call to make, and as always, you should consider the rest of your team. So if we take a look at some sample sets, this is the most basic Mega Kangaskhan one, but it's also probably the most common one out there. You know, just max 4 252, 252 spread, Fake Out, Low Kick, Double Edge, and Sucker Punch. So this one's meant for more damage output. As you see, there's no Power Up Punch. Low Kick is just meant to get quick damage off immediately, Double Edge as well. Of course, you could use Admin Nature on this one, but I think a lot of people like Jolly because it ensures that you outspeed Pokemon like Hydreigon. Also helps that you at worst speed high with opposing Kangaskhan's. And I know a lot of players don't like the Kangaskhan speed war. So player, you know, by going with Jolly, you ensure that you at least speed high with it, if not outspeed it. You know, this one does have Scrappy. I think the ability is an interesting case of discussion. I personally like Scrappy the most because it allows you to hit Gengar with a Fake Out, and since most Gengars are Focus Sashed, and given how big of a threat Gengar can be to Kangaskhan, I feel like with Fake Out and Scrappy, it just helps out so much, though Inner Focus can definitely work out as well. This next one is a bulky spread actually that I used at the 2014 World Championships. As I mentioned, I did use a bulkier spread there, and that's because I did not want to go for pure offense there. I knew attacks like Choice Specs, Hydreigon, Draco Meteor would be very popular given how good Hydreigon was last year, and you know, lo and behold, I ended up facing 3 Hydreigons in the rounds at Worlds, and this Kangaskhan spread really helped out. So you see there's 188 in speed. That was the main focus, first of all, to outspeed Pokemon like Mega Blastoise and Smeargle, which I knew at least one player, Randy Quaw, would be bringing to Worlds. And then the rest was really invested in HP and special defense, you know, only 20 special defense, but with that spread, you can survive Choice Specs, Draco Meteor from Modest Hydreigon, which I thought was really important. 76 attack and 12 in defense. Now I went for Admin Nature because I didn't feel the need for Jolly. You know, I didn't care about really speed tying with opposing Mega Kangaskhan's. I didn't know how fast other Kangaskhan's would be built, and my team was actually really heavily designed to beat Kangaskhan. I had Pokemon like Hariyama, Ferrothorn with Rocky Helmet, I had Gothitelle to trap it in, I had Salamence to intimidate it, so I wasn't worried about opposing Kangaskhan's. Now I opted for Fake Out, Power Up Punch, Double Edge, and Sucker Punch. Of course I couldn't get Low Kick last year, but I think it's interesting because at the beginning of VGC 2014, almost all players were using Return, and then at Worlds we suddenly saw this shift to Double Edge because players realized, you know, I'm going to go with the bulkier spread, I'm going to want more damage output. In the Junior Division Finals, I think both finalists ended up using Double Edge on their Kangaskhan, and it ended up helping out, I think, both players because it allowed them to get the extra damage that they wouldn't have gotten without Return. So I like Double Edge more personally, but you should also consider whether you want that recoil or not, because sometimes it really can add up. So these are a couple of damage calculations I'm using as a sample. Of course, it's just 2 Pokemon that I'm referring to, Hydreigon and Terrakion, but I think it's a good basis for you to really think about how you want to build your Kangaskhan's, because you can see how different each spread and each nature really does. So, you know, if we're using the 4 252 252 spread with no special defense or HP investment, a max Modest Draco Meteor from Hydreigon can knock you out 7/8 of the time, which is a pretty scary statistic. However, if you are running Jolly, you can outspeed it and just KO it, but And now we get into a discussion of return versus double edge. So the next thing to look at is, let's say you're using Jolly Kangaskhan with return. Now you see against even a 4 HP Hydreigon, you have a 0.4% chance of 1-hit KOing them, so not very high. You know, that's why players are moving towards double edge more, I'd say, in VGC 2015. If you give that an adamant nature, suddenly it's a 50% chance of 1-hit KO, so significantly higher. But you can use the Jolly spread with double edge, so, you know, you're replacing return for double edge, so you're putting some recoil and damage, and suddenly your chance of 1-hit KOing is 93.8%. I think that's why we do see double edge a lot more. A lot of Pokemon can take returns, you know, just with a little of HP, like return will bring them very low but not KO them. For example, Sylveons also tend to be easy to survive return, but if you add double edge there, most of the times they have to have so much investment that it's very difficult to knock it out. Of course, it might be a damage roll because Hydreigons tend to be a bit more invested, but my case here is you can see how different having Jolly versus admin is and return versus double edge. Now, final calculation I wanted to include, I thought was one that was pretty interesting. It was surviving a close combat from Jolly Terrakion, which is a really common move used to counter Mega Kangaskhan. With 244 HP and 148 defense, you can actually survive it 100% of the time. Of course, you have to give up so much attack and speed there, so I'm not sure if it's really worth it, but something to consider in building your Kangaskhan's, and, you know, maybe you want to consider it. You can certainly fit onto slower and bulkier teams, and, you know, I just wanted to throw that damage calculation out there for you guys. So let's talk about the EV spread. Like I mentioned earlier, when you're considering a nature, you've got Jolly, which is important because it actually outspeeds max speed Landorus T. So spreads like Focus Sash, Choice Band, or Assault Vest, you can outspeed those. And it also outspeeds max speed Hydreigon, which, like I mentioned earlier, is pretty important. Now, I realized that previously the example with return on Hydreigon is kind of silly because, you know, low kick is better. You'd use low kick really to KO it, but I think I just wanted to point out the different amounts of damage you could do there in that case. So I guess I could have actually picked a better Pokemon in retrospect, but I think it really highlights the discrepancies in damage output there. You know, like I mentioned earlier, you really want to consider, because if you're running max speed Kangaskhan, you at worst speed tie with opposing Kangaskhan's, whereas if you're not running max speed, you don't know how fast your opponent is, and some players like playing with that kind of security, knowing it's a 50% chance of outspeeding, and after the first one I can really figure out. But, you know, like, if you don't run any bulk, then Spectral Meteor and, like, Modest or just Charizard Y Overheat and Sun can 1-hit KO you, whereas bulk can really save you in those situations. So also consider that, and ultimately the most important thing is just remember what role Kangaskhan has on your team and the rest of your team. You know, if your team is meant to counter Pokemon that beat Kangaskhan, then you can afford to use 4, 252, 252. If your team kind of suffers against Pokemon, you know, maybe you want to go for a more bulkier spread, but it's something that you really have to consider. But all I'm saying is the most basic spread works. So, some good partners for it. It feels a bit silly to have this slide because Mega Kangaskhan is so good, it fits onto basically any team. You can really slap it on for your Mega Evolution and it will work. But it really likes to be paired with Pokemon that can beat fighting types, like counters to Terrakion and Conkeldurr, so fairy types like Sylveon are actually very popular. Ghost type Pokemon also give it a lot of trouble, so Pokemon with dark type attacks are good partners, like Hydreigon, you know, of course with Dark Pulse, can knock out Aegislash and Gengar, which can give Kangaskhan some trouble. Some other popular partners, according to 3DS Pokemon: Landorus T, Thundurus, Sylveon, Bisharp, Heatran, Rotom-Wash, Aegislash, Cresselia, and Talonflame. None of those should surprise you, those are basically the best Pokemon around in the format. And it's like, that's why Kangaskhan's so good, because you can just pair it out with other strong Pokemon with good base stats and abilities, and suddenly you've got a really good VGC 2015 team already. So, how to beat it? I think Kangaskhan is a lot easier to beat this year than VGC 2014 if you played that year at all, but fighting type Pokemon are what I look at first because they're difficult to knock out. For example, Conkeldurr is slower but can take a return or a double edge and can just KO back with a Drain Punch. Terrakion and Virizion are two of my favorite because they outspeed and knock it out with a close combat, unless of course the Kangaskhan's really bulky. Ghost types like Gengar and Aegislash, you know, you have to play a bit carefully because sometimes they have Crunch, you know, they have Scrappy so they can fake you out, but otherwise, you know, you can Will-O-Wisp with Gengar, Aegislash can just Flash Cannon and then King Shield once again. So the typing here helps you out a lot because Kangaskhan's can't touch it too well as long as you avoid the Sucker Punches. Double targeting it's really helpful as well, you know, because it's normal type, it doesn't actually resist many types out there, so you can get damage out there, but you just need to really constantly nuke it down because it's so naturally bulky. Intimidate's really helpful as well. We don't see Intimidate as much this year in the sense that if you have Intimidate in your team, a lot of times it's actually tied to a Mega Evolution like Salamence or Mawile. Landorus T, Arcanine actually another Intimidator that could work, but Intimidate really sets it down because it makes those KOs into 2-hit KOs and whatnot. And then just overall powerful attacks like Charwise, Overheat, Sylveon's Hyper Voice, Mega Salamence's Double Edge, Lando T's Superpower, etc. These are all attacks that would do huge amounts of damage even if it is a bulkier spread, like at least 60 to 70%. So that plus, you know, another targeted attack lets weaker can knock it out immediately. And then status conditions, like with the case with any Pokemon, Kangaskhan does not like getting burned, does not like getting paralyzed, and then you can use that completely to your advantage, since Kangaskhan kind of relies on not getting inflicted by status. So that is why Facade is used sometimes, but personally not my favorite move out there. So in conclusion, you know, Mega Kangaskhan is one of the most popular, actually it is the most popular Pokemon in VGC 15. As always, you really need to prepare for it. It is, I think, easier to beat in 2014 than in 2014 because of Pokemon like Terrakion, Thundurus to slow it down, Landorus, for Intimidate and Superpower, etc. So I don't think it's nearly as good as it was in 2014. I think there are a lot of better not a lot of better, but there are a lot of good Mega Evolutions this year. Whereas in 2014, it's like I have to use Kangaskhan, I have to use Maul Y, I have to use Charizard Y, and Kangaskhan was on top of that list until I'd say the 2014 World Championships. Like I mentioned earlier, since it's normal, getting damaged isn't difficult, but the most important thing is make sure Kangaskhan doesn't do too much against your team, because if it gets a power-up punch-off, if it gets a return or a low kick-off to knock you out, then you're already losing a Pokemon. So you really want to take it out before it uses its speed to its advantage and knocks out your own Pokemon. Of course, it is really difficult to one-hit KO it without those fighting type attacks, so remember that. Remember that it almost will always get a couple of attacks off, so try to take advantage of this by switching out, you know, making good predictions and whatnot, and rendering it useless while your other partner can target it down. And of course, if it sets up a power-up punch boost, you better remove it as soon as possible, because it is not fun staring down a +2 Mega Kangaskhan. Anyway, that's it for this analysis, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Mega Kangaskhan is a Pokemon you see everywhere, and it's pretty extensive, but I figured, you know, this would give you some rundown and information on what you can do to beat it, and, you know, what you can do to use it as a potential Pokemon. You know, there are definitely better spreads out there, I'm sure, for bulkier ones, but I thought mine is a pretty good base mark for the 2014, or for this season. And I think this just shows you like Kangaskhan is still just really good, and it has so many diverse movesets and ways you can run it. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. As always, leave a like if you did, and I shall see you tomorrow. Alright, peace.